Like a lot of people, I've been thinking about nationalism. If I start with my own place, Britain. What is Britain? Well, it's a small group of islands off the coast of Europe. Can't argue with that. Except that makes nonsense of a statement like Britain votes to leave Europe. So clearly Britain also means a population of people. Now, I live in Simonstown in South Africa, and people say that's a very British place. And I didn't think so until, having lived for many years in South Africa, I begin to notice that, yes, there are certain British touches about it, which suggests that Britain is more than just an island or a group of people. It's also a sort of culture, something much more subtle. And then people talk about the damage that Britain has done. And you realise they're talking about a history, not just the present culture, but the history of Britain, where the culture was very different in the past. So, what do we mean by Britain? Now, the National Trust, who has responsibility for preserving a lot of sort of British heritage, not just the stately homes, but also things like I think the house where the Beatles were born, and sort of industrial archaeology, things like that. They have a concept of the spirit of place. The idea is that every place, no matter how big or small, has its own spirit. The accumulation of its history and myths, its physical and spiritual characteristics, and the people who have shaped it. That's rather lovely to me because, of course, that's the Latin idea of the genius loci, the spirit of a place. And it can be a small place, like a little wood or a copse, or it can be something big like Britain or an island. And if it's a spirit, then the question is, to what extent can one dialogue with it? And it's an idea to begin with listening. Now, in the 50s, there was a thing called psychogeography. It was defined by a guy called Guy Debord, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, as the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organised not on the emotions and behaviour of individuals. In other words, how the place was speaking to you and how you would sense that in terms of emotions and feelings. And it led to a whole sort of set of techniques, a thing you could do, described as a whole toy box full of playful, inventive strategies for exploring cities. Just about anything that takes pedestrians off their predictable paths and jolts them into new awareness of the urban landscape. This was very much a town phenomenon. Led to the theory of the derive in 1958, a document which essentially serves as an instruction manual for the psychogeographic procedure, execute an act of derive, which you could translate as drift. In a derive, one or more persons during a certain period drop their usual motives for movement and action, their relations, their work and leisure activities, and let themselves be drawn by the attractions of the train and encounters they find there. In other words, in a sense, they're listening to the spirit of the place, rather than saying, this is my commuter route or whatever. And that idea sort of always rather intrigued me, because I like to visit a place and sort of imagine that I've never been there before. Usually some sort of boring place, like when I was at school, my school, which I hated because it was school and I didn't like Bristol because of that. But if I sort of stepped back and thought, well, what if I was a tourist here? I realised actually it's a marvellous place, and some of the school buildings are really rather beautiful. So how could I get that feeling? Now, I think it was in the 90s, a number of people sort of played around with this type of exploring a place, trying to see it fresh for the first time. And one of the tricks they used was there's a soap opera in Britain, a radio one called The Archers. And the BBC issued a map of the little village of the Archers and all the features in it. And people had the idea of exploring some village using the wrong map. In other words, take the Ambridge map, and you get there and you look around, sort of, this map isn't very good, is it? There's the church. Okay, yes, right, now we know where we are. Well, there should be a pub called the Bull down the road from the church. Hang on, there's one called the Black Horse. Oh, obviously they've changed the name. Yeah, okay. And so basically you go around the place getting thoroughly lost and confused by your map. And it results in a sort of a new experience of the place. You find things you would have never found normally. You have to sort of close down everything you know about that place or whatever. Now, that actually... there's equivalent things now. I believe there's a Derive app, and apps like that. And what they do is they sort of they're almost like a send up of the Satnav. The idea is because they throw in some extra weird instructions. You try to get from A to B, and you might have an instruction like follow the next Volkswagen you see for 1 minute, then turn right when you next feel like it, or something like that. In other words, how to get interestingly lost in a place which might otherwise be familiar, and to see it with those fresh eyes. Now, psychogeography was very much around the idea of exploring a city, but I say why a city, because I was brought up in deep country, and so I was used to wandering around in nature. In fact, enthusiastic walkers invite me to go walking, I say, no, I'm a Neanderthal. In other words, I like to meander around. And in one of my early videos on YouTube, I've described a process which is almost like reading the landscape, either on the big scale or the small scale, almost as if it was a tarot spread. Now that, I think, applies more in the city, because in the city you see big sort of recognizable images, a church, a car, a shop, whatever. And so you can read it like a tarot spread. You ask yourself a question, and you look up and there's a church. What is this telling me? Is it saying I should take a more spiritual view, or I ought to be a bit more conventional, or what? And so on. Now, if you do that in the country, it's a bit more like teacup fortune telling, because the country, although it can show you a tree or a daffodil or something very recognizable, it can also throw up a lot of almost random images to look for patterns in. Suddenly your eye is caught by a rather unusual scattering of stones on the ground, or some leaves have fallen in an interesting pattern, and you try to look at those and say, is it trying to tell me something? Is there meaning? Meaning is the word here, because we're sort of looking for meaning in what might otherwise be familiar landscape. Now, it's often said about tourism, about pilgrimages, that they are a search for meaning. And what is different then for pilgrimage and tourism? Now, in a way, tourism is often a search for meaning, because people go to places often for rather abstract reasons, like they're the trendy place to be, something like that. And the tour company is the one that does all the searching and then sells you the idea. You're just expected to go there and sort of suck that meaning out. This is the place to be. I'll take some photographs so I can show other people, and so on and so forth. That's why tourism can actually degrade the place rather than have a real dialogue with it. You see, I remember the time in the 50s when it was really a smart thing to do was to go to Spain, and then that became a cliche. Then it was Greece, and then, I don't know, Bali or somewhere. And then you get to the point where the only really trendy place to go is something like the Antarctic, just because no one else has been there. It's sort of sucking out the spirit of the place, eating it, and destroying it. Now, a pilgrimage is rather different because you're putting something in. If you take something like the Santiago de Compostela walk, a lot of people do that, but the majority of them are going there really listening to the walk as they do it, listening to the place, meditating as they go along. So they're not just taking something out, they're also putting something back in. And the effect is to strengthen that feeling that this is a very special pilgrimage. Now, of course, if it caught on too much, that could begin to drain away. If you've got coachloads of people all doing it, and they say that even something like climbing Mount Everest, there are now so many people doing it that it begins to lose the magic that it once had. That sort of pilgrimage idea I always found very attractive. I mean, in Britain there was the following ley lines, the sun and the serpent, following them across Britain. To go to places on those ley lines and to sit and meditate and listen to the place and get an idea of what it could mean. And then you take something from that and you give something to it. I've been to places like Avebury and Stonehenge and the Rollright Stones and spent a long time sitting there. I'm getting something from it, but I'm also contributing to charging it up. Now, there was a time when I was aware that you could go to a place like Avebury and you would see people arrive and do a ritual and then go away. And there was a feeling sometimes that these people had thought up a ritual in some faraway place, sat round a table in London, said, let's go to Avebury and let's work out a ritual we're going to do. And they come and do it, and it may actually contribute to Avebury. It may help to build up that sense of sacredness. But it's also a bit of an imposition from outside, and what I like to do was to go to the place, Avebury. Sometimes I spent a night there, camping there, and sort of asking the place what it would like me to do as a ritual. You come up with some sort of quite interesting ideas, and then you do that ritual. Now, what is different? It's hard to say really, but there is a feeling that I had had a dialogue with the place rather than just come along and impose something on it. Now, why am I talking about this? It's because the other day I came across a crowdfunding thing for a book called In Satnav We Trust, described as a search for meaning through the historic counties of England. And in the right tab he talks about exploring science and religion and a search for meaning. Now the thing is, the guy who's done this, Jack Barrow, I realised I knew him from the past. He was a magic associate of mine. We did quite a lot of work together in different magic groups. And I know that he shares with me a particular interest in the sort of relationship between magic and rationalism, or science, if you like. And I noticed that on his website he talks about religion and science. And that interested me because I'm sure he's really talking about magic and science. And he's playing it down in order to get published. Now, I phoned him up to find out about this. And I'm going to follow this up with another video, because the interesting thing for me was not only what he was doing in terms of sort of a pilgrimage where you listen to the place and look for meaning and then move on to other places, following a path that is to some extent dictated by the places themselves. My recording was interrupted, so I'm just going to add what I was going to say. That there's two things that struck me about this. One is, the shared interest in exploring and communicating with the genius of a place and making a sort of pilgrimage out of it. But the other thing is that he is trying to reach a general audience. He would like to have this book clearly on bookshelves and not be necessarily sort of ghettoed away into the mind, body and spirit, or even only available on Amazon. And he's using a publishing company which is a crowd-funded one, which is rather unusual. And it was one that I tried to get my book published in and didn't succeed. So the whole question of how it is one gets a book about magic, taking magic seriously, through the publishing hurdles interests me. So that's what I'm going to talk about on a follow-up video to this.